One is don't believe you're entitled to success. Two, you've got to be willing to take risks. And the third one is be on time. Being on time is something that makes or breaks relationships. It makes or breaks the way you do business. And it instills a certain level of confidence in the people around you.
GovCon has a language of its own. Acronyms, compliance, contracting, and when you're new, it can feel a little bit like alphabet soup. And no one hands you a decoder ring, and that's why we're here. I'm your host, Amanda Ziadeh, and this is Rookies to Rockstars, where we get real about how people actually break in, level up, and lead in government contracting. Not everyone starts in GovCon. Some come from completely different worlds, and today's guest is one of them. David Guffey, Director of U.S. Special Operations Command and Intelligence Community Accounts at Intel, began his career in the Air Force, serving across active duty, the Guard, and the Reserve before transitioning to the private sector. That path taught him how to bridge two worlds, defense and industry, and build the kind of relationships that last decades. In this episode, David shares how he translated military experience into commercial success, learned to take smart risks, and discovered that the long game is always worth it. Let's get into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Rookies to Rockstars, a short, sharp series where we ask smart people one thing. What do you know now that you wish someone had told you at the start? I'm your host today, Amanda Ziadeh, and our guest is David Guffey, Director of U.S. Special Operations Command and Intelligence Community Accounts at Intel. David, thank you for being here today. We're so happy to have you on the show.
Good morning.
So, David, I understand that you've built a career in GovCon focusing on the defense and intelligence communities, and we're super interested to know how one rises to lead U.S. SOCOM and IC accounts for Fortune 100. But to start, I'd love to ask how you got your start after college. What was your first big break into the industry?
It was a bit of an interesting trajectory because, like so many of us in this business, you start off in the military. So I went into the Air Force, transitioned from active duty to Guard to Reserve. So I hit all three components. During that time, during the Guard and Reserve, of course, I was traditional guardsman, traditional reservist. So had a civilian job that went along with that. And I transitioned back and forth between those entities, between that commercial component and the military component as the military saw fit. So there were deployments in there. There were activations during OAF and OEF during Iraq and Afghanistan. And then as I would come off of those deployments, I'd go back to my commercial job. I think this is very common also amongst people that either are coming out of college or do that transition from the military into the civilian life. Is we tend to look at what we do in the military and we believe that that is the best way for us to transition to the commercial world is through something that is attached to the military or the intelligence community, whichever one you were involved in. And sometimes I think that's maybe a bit of a disadvantage, but at least in this role, when you've had that experience in the military, you, of course, are very marketable to people and systems integrators, resellers, companies like that are involved in the military DoD IC realm. And so that's how I got in this, was by taking my military experience and transitioning that to the commercial side.
GovCon is a natural fit for that kind of transition.
It is. And I try to tell people it's not the only one that's out there. I think we all get locked into thinking that it's the only thing that we can do. But certainly it's a natural progression because you understand the language, you understand the acronyms, you understand the culture. And so it does make for an easier transition.
Makes sense. And how did that come about, having a commercial position while you were in the reserves? Was there an opportunity that came about for you, or was that something that you had thought about doing for this transition?
I don't think I put a lot of thought into it. And I think that's what happens with a lot of us. You're just searching for that next opportunity, and you're trying to figure out where you're going to go in the commercial world. And so these opportunities pop up. Now, as a reservist, a guardsman, when you're being deployed, there are challenges there because you're taking away from that time in the civilian world and commercial world. And that brings with it a bit of challenge because while you're out of that commercial world doing your deployment, of course, your colleagues are then still progressing through. But I think where you gain an advantage, or at least it evens out, is the fact that as you're doing that reserve and guard time, you're doing that military time, you're still building those connections, you're still building that knowledge, you're still building that expertise. And while you may be out of the commercial world for a certain amount of time, fulfilling those military duties, you're also building that knowledge base. And so I feel like it evens out very much. And I feel like in my case, I think a lot of people that do it this way, that interaction and that being able to float back and forth between the two I think brings a lot of knowledge and expertise, not just from the military side to the commercial side, but there's a lot of things that transition from the commercial side back to your military duties as well. So I think there's some real advantages there. And that's what I try to tell people who are making that transition or looking at doing it this way. That's a good way of approaching it.
That makes sense. And just to backtrack a tiny bit, what drew you to serving to the military? Did you have a passion for serving the country early on?
I think it's like everybody coming out of college, you're looking for what's going to be exciting, what's going to be interesting. I wanted to travel, I wanted to get out and see the world, and this was a way of doing it. I don't know that I had, in fact, I know I did not have any plan to progress through the military. I was just taking it one day, one promotion at a time, and whatever happened. And then, of course, life happens. And as life happens, and you have children and you have family, and you have to balance and adjust those things. And that's where I looked at, okay, do I stay with the active duty for 20 or 25 years, or do I make this transition? And I knew people that had made that transition from active duty into the commercial world, and yet they kept that engagement on the military side, and that had a real appeal to me.
Cool. What was the biggest cultural shift for you during that transition, or was there one?
I think there's really more culture shift with the people that are bringing you on board than the other
Mm,
way around, because we know the acronyms. We know and understand that, hey, being on time is crucial, that understanding the language and the culture is important, and building those relationships, whether you're in the military, out of the military, those things are important. And so I think it was not as much a culture shift as I thought it was going to be. I felt like it was more the people that were bringing me on board that were adjusting their culture to fit me and the people that are coming out. And that was in a very positive way. So they were learning something from me. And I felt I and other people doing it this way were bringing a lot of things to them.
that makes sense. And now, having sat on this side of the public private sector industry for a while, is there anything that you would recommend industry does maybe better or thinks about more when they are bringing in employees from the military side, just to ease that transition or make it a little bit more comfortable?
I think that since 9/11, and we've had so many people serve, and both on the active duty and on the reserve and guard side, that companies are very good when you look at everything from small companies to large systems integrators, small software companies. So many of them, especially in the DC area, have had experience with this, that they really do manage that relationship very well. I know here at Intel, there's a whole support group within Intel that works with people who are still in the Guard and Reserve. I've long since retired. But I think these companies have done a really good job of understanding the challenges of serving on both sides, of having that military side, having that commercial side. I think they do a lot to support everything that I've seen out of this industry. I think been a lot of lessons learned. I think these companies have learned those lessons well, and I think they do a really great job of supporting the people that make those transitions, whether it's going full active duty into full commercial or whether you're straddling that fence.
That's great to hear. I'm sure also for others making a similar transition or a similar path forward. I think that's a positive take on it. Thanks for sharing that. I'm also curious if there's any piece of advice or knowledge about the GovCon industry that you wish you had at the beginning that you'd like to share.
You shared some of these questions with me prior to the weekend, and I pondered over them quite a bit. What a lot of us come out of the military thinking is that that military knowledge will build instant success, and it doesn't. And while I think all of these companies are really good at assimilating folks from the military into the commercial world, and they've got support mechanisms and resources and people with a lot of experience. The one thing they don't tell you, because maybe it's assumed, is that you should never believe that success is guaranteed, that somehow this translates into instant success. There are things that you do have to transition to in this realm in terms of culture and understanding. You're dealing with a lot of people who are not military. You're dealing with a lot of people in terms of customers who aren't necessarily military. So they may not have the same mindset. And I think that's probably the one thing that if I were in that position again, or as people do come into our company, I try to tell them, hey, don't believe that success is instant, that it's something that happens automatically. but it's something that's going to have to build over time. So you can't get frustrated when after 6 months, you haven't seen that level of success you thought you were going to have. It does take a little time. So you try to articulate that to people who are coming into this realm so that they don't get frustrated. They don't get overly challenged with trying to grasp this concept of coming from one world into another.
Did you at that point feel a little bit behind compared to your colleagues when you made the full switch?
I did because they knew the language of this world and I didn't. So the realm of the commercial world, they understood that. They understood profit and loss and G&A and all these other things. And I'm scratching my head saying, gosh, I don't know what that is. And so you get a little frustrated with that. And then in a realm where you're, say, in sales or business development or contracting or capture or whatever it is, even if you come into this with a very solid background in the military or whatever, you still have to fit into this role in this realm. And you have to learn what the other side is thinking, what the other side is doing. And it's not instantaneous. And I think a lot of us, as we make that transition, feel like it's going to be a lot more instant.
Mhm.
It's going to happen a lot more quickly, and it doesn't. And taking that 6 months or a year to fully understand and grasp these things, I wish I had understood that was going to be a little bit more of a challenge. I would have been less frustrated along the way.
Got it. Yep, that makes sense. Did you have any resources or did you leverage any resources available to you at the time to help shift that mindset, or was it just pushing through?
It was more pushing through because I
Mm.
started initially at a very small company, and so they had no resources. They were great to me. They were wonderful in accommodating my every so often transitioning from civilian to military life, but they didn't have resources. It wasn't until I went to a larger company where there were more resources. But I think at that point in time, I had the knowledge and expertise. I think what I would say to people that do make that transition is use the resources that are within the military to help you make those transitions. There are very good resources there. Now, as you get into larger companies, the larger systems integrators, larger manufacturers, they understand that and they have had so many people come through that they do make that transition a lot easier. So a lot of it depends on the size of the company, maybe what their background is with the military. When you get into a large systems integrator, they've been so involved in the military and intelligence community that it's very easy for them to
Mhm.
help people assimilate. But if you're going to something that's not really cognizant of the military as much as, say, a systems integrator or reseller or whatever, it's maybe a bit more of a challenge. It's a bit of give and take there. Some of that is them learning and understanding what you're going through, and some of it is you articulating back to them the challenges that you go through. So I think there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship that's got to occur there.
That makes sense. I'm also curious about the progression of your career in industry, the highlights, the opportunities that came about that ultimately landed you where you are today. I know it's a big question, but if there were just some important moments for you.
It goes through a series of relationships. And that's actually a really good question because as I look at my first job, there are people that I'm dealing with now in my current position. They're not with this company, but they're partners that I engage with. There are a number of them that were people that I knew at my first job coming out of the military. And so building that relationship over time has provided this ability to make the transition from one company to the next, from one position to the next, keeping those relationships going. Nobody took away anything from this conversation other than the one piece of advice of building those relationships over time and making sure that you maintain them over time is probably the best thing that you could possibly do. Because ultimately, it's a small enough community that you end up working with somebody 20 years down the road that you met 20 years prior.
How do you recommend the younger generation put themselves out there to network early on or to form those relationships if they're not comfortable with that type of communication? I think it's interesting because we've talked to other executives about this topic about how the communication methods shifted, especially during COVID, and those coming out of college might not feel so comfortable with the in-person forms of communication. Is that something that you're seeing or something that they might have to overcome?
That's a challenge because I think the one thing that AI is never going to replace, and that's, of course, a big discussion now, is what is AI going to do for us in the
Right.
future? The one thing it's not going to do It is not going to establish that human connection between people, individuals, groups.
Hmm.
What I would say to people who are maybe not as comfortable in this role, if you're wanting to do sales, business development, capture, things like that, you're going to have to find a way to force yourself to really become engaged at a face-to-face level. And whether that's through trade shows, symposiums, after hours meetings, it is all about those relationships. And if you can't establish those, you're always going to be challenged along the way. You're never going to get those positions that you ultimately seek because you haven't built those relationships. So if this is something that you're challenged with, you really have to force yourself to get over that and engage more. Now, there are plenty of jobs out there where it doesn't require that sort of engagement, but on the sales side, business development side, you have to have that constant, continual engagement. You have to build those relationships. And I would also say they've got to be genuine relationships too. It can't just be transactional. What are you going to buy from me? Well, that's it's all well and good. You have to make those sales. But along the way, the more you know and understand about the people that you're dealing with, whether it's somebody in your company or it's somebody at another company, a partner, or even a competitor, the better you are in establishing that rapport with those people around you. And I would say that for people that are younger, that have grown up with social media, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever, you're going to have to let go of that. And you're going to have to find a way of engaging on a personal face to face level.
Yeah, that makes sense. Networking in this industry is so important. I think it's just a part of it, something to get used to. I'm also interested in your take on taking risks. Was there a big risk that you took during your career or during a transition? Did it pay off? And kind of what would you tell others about taking risks with your career decisions?
I won't go into all the details. I would say there was a risk that I took early on that did not pay off. And there were people, colleagues that scratched their heads and said, wow, I admire you for taking that risk. It's not one I would take. But I was willing to take that risk and it didn't pay off. But what it does is along the way, it helps you reformulate a plan. It helps you adjust your trajectory. It helps you navigate through things. And so when I look back at that particular risk that I took that I failed at, there were many lessons learned. How did I approach it? What did I achieve? What did I not achieve? What could I have done better? What did I do right that was overlooked? First off, it made me not risk averse, which I think in this business, in all business, you have to take calculated risk, but you should never be risk averse. You should be willing to take that chance, that gamble, because I think oftentimes people respect the fact you took a risk. They like the fact that you took a risk. And I think that opens up a lot more possibilities. But you also have to realize that somewhere in there, you're going to fail at that as well. And
Hmm.
you've got to be willing to fail at that and then get up and move on. So I would say that there was one event in my life where I took a big, huge risk and it didn't pay off.
Hmm.
But then I look at how that affected all the other decisions I made, and it definitely had a very positive influence on how I approach things.
That makes sense. I think this says a lot about adaptability as well, especially in this industry when, the government can change or executive orders can come through and just the industry can change as a whole, but being able to make decisions quickly on your feet or move with the way that the industry is going is probably a learned experience, something to get comfortable with early on.
And this is an environment now, I think we've all seen it over the last 6 or 7 months, where there's a lot of uncertainty. And
Mhm.
so I think sometimes people look at that uncertainty and say, oh, I don't want to take that risk.
Right.
And I would almost argue that now is the time to take that risk. Find
Mhm.
that company out there that maybe is sort of on the edge of a new technology or new way of manufacturing or whatever. And look at that and make a calculated risk. Look at what is the future of that? What is the potential? What is the possibility? Is this something worth doing? And then, of course, you have to look at all the things, all the other life things that are around you and say, okay, if I'm in this position, maybe I'm willing to take more of a risk here than if I'm in this position over here where, yeah, maybe it doesn't make sense to take as much of a risk. So I
Right.
think you've got to look at all of those life events that are around you. Where are you in life? Certainly, I think that when you're fresh out of college or even fresh out of the military, let's say you've done a 4 year or 6 year, 8 year stint in the military, I think that the possibilities and the value of taking those risks is really high. I think there's a lot of good value there. Imagine
Hmm.
people that took a risk on SpaceX years ago. They're probably in a pretty good position. And I would
Hmm.
say risks like that are well worth taking. And then some of it's just, what are you comfortable with doing? For me, I felt very comfortable taking a risk that I knew maybe only had a 50-50 chance or a 40-60 chance of actual success, but it was
Hmm.
worth doing.
So let's talk a bit about challenges, something that you truly had to overcome to progress. If there was a challenge that you had to work through and what mindset that helped you get to the other side.
This is going to be one of those places where you're going to have to do a lot of editing. Wow.
No problem.
So again, not going into all the details, but there was a challenge, and I would say not in the too distant past, where I had to do a bit of introspective
Mhm.
evaluation of myself and ask, okay, is this something that I brought the challenge on myself, or was this something where the challenge was forced upon me? And I would say that having that ability to look introspectively at yourself and look at yourself in a very objective way. And we all look at ourselves somewhat subjectively, but I had to look at myself, my future, my goals, my current status, my current trajectory. And I had to look at it very objectively and look at that challenge very objectively. And I did. And I think doing that is what got me actually to this position here, because it made me look at all of those things. It then goes back to your question about the risk and what are you willing to do, what you're not willing to do. And that was one of those situations where, as I looked at that challenge, I looked at myself introspectively, I looked at myself objectively, and I looked at where I wanted to go. It then set that stage for, okay, this is a risk I'm willing to take. And that was a risk that when I looked at, I said, yeah, there's a probably an 80% chance that I'm going to be successful at this risk, that this risk will pay off. And it did. It was 100% paid off. And it's why I landed where I am at now, was looking at that challenge, taking that challenge head on, looking at myself objectively, and then using all that to make a conscious decision about that risk.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. I think it's an important note for rising professionals in this industry to know that these challenges can happen at any point in your career and you'll be faced with them at any point in your career. It doesn't just happen when you're fresh. So,
It does. And I would also say that anybody coming into industry, come into this with your eyes wide open, that these risks and these challenges are going to exist all along the way. That not every company is a perfect fit, not
mhm.
every relationship is a perfect fit. And it doesn't mean that, you're not competent, you're not professional. It just means that sometimes it's like anything in life, whether you're flying a plane, whether you're sailing a boat, you've got to make small course corrections in order to get to that destination. And I would say, if I use that analogy, that's probably the best way to look at it.
So I'm curious, the intel and defense space can sometimes be a mysterious one, obviously an extremely important one, a large market industry. What is the hardest part about working in this particular environment, and how would you prepare the next generation for it?
I would say that on the Department of Defense side, because my relationships started off deeper there, it was easier to overcome and find myself more as part of what those people did on a day-to-day basis. I had the language, I had the knowledge, I had the expertise, I had the relationships. On the IC side, not quite as much. That wasn't my background. I had learned more of that intelligence community aspect through my commercial work. And so my relationships didn't go as deep. And that's something that you have to be very persistent with, very patient with, not overstep your boundaries, not push your way into something. But there are times where it makes sense to sort of let things come to you, that you, on the intelligence community side, it's a slightly different environment than the DoD side. And so I would say understanding what those two environments were like, understanding what those differences were like, taking the strengths that I had in each one of those, and then using them to further along the relationships, the knowledge, the understanding, the insight. And then over time, then you find yourself building those relationships and that knowledge and that expertise. So now you have a much better understanding of what that customer's needs are, what their desires are, what their challenges are, and then, of course, building good relationships along the way.
That's a good point. Oftentimes, defense and intelligence are coupled together, so you don't think to separate them when you're speaking casually. But I'm sure they have obviously very different systemic buildups and everything. Yeah.
They do. And then, of
Yeah.
course, along the way, you'll find people in those organizations that maybe had a similar background to you. And when you find that connection, it then makes the transition, that ability to build that relationship a little bit easier. But when you're dealing with folks that maybe have been homegrown, have come up through that, on the intelligence community side, have always been there, that's a little bit different challenge to build that relationship because they have their knowledge and understanding of their environment. You're coming from a little different angle. And so it just takes a little time, a little patience.
All right. So, sitting where you sit now, career wise, how has your idea of success changed, or has it changed?
I think it's like everything. I had a friend of mine say to me once, life is what happens when you're making plans. And
Mhm.
so you come out of college and you have an idea of this is what I want to be when I grow up. This is what I want to be 25 years from now. And then all these things happen along the way. I certainly, when I went in the military in the late 80s, never could have predicted that 9/11 would have happened. But well, 9/11 had a huge impact on my career. It caused me to rethink where I was in the military. It caused me to rethink where I was on the commercial side. Was I going to stay on the active duty? Was I going to go to the guard? What was I going to do? All of these unforeseen things that happen, whether it be geopolitical, whether it be financial, whether it be personal, whether it be business related, all of them have a way of maybe knocking you off course, sometimes knocking you onto course, and maybe helping you refine and have a better understanding of what direction you want to go. Maybe you look at something 10 years into a career and say, yeah, I thought I wanted to do that, but what I really want to do is this. If you had asked me 30 years ago when I went in the military, or 34 years, 35 years ago when I went in the military, would I see myself at this point in life? I would have said no. So some of it is just that willingness to accept some of the things that happen along the way and enjoy them. It was very enjoyable getting to this stage. I would not have predicted it would happen in this way, but I made sure that I enjoyed every step along the way.
My last question for you, kind of a bit on a sillier note, we like to end on. What is one military habit that was the hardest for you to break in civilian life?
It's not hard to break, and I'll never break it, but it's being on time. And I
Okay.
think, and there was one question you asked me about in the list of questions you
Mhm.
presented initially, what would you recommend? And I would say, hey, a couple things. One is don't believe you're entitled to success. Two, you've got to be willing to take risks. And the third one is be on time. Being on time is something that makes or breaks relationships. It makes or breaks the way you do business, and it instills a certain level of confidence in the people around you. And so I would say that's probably the one thing that I never will break. But if I were to look at one thing that I do find myself having to step back from, it's that constant use of military jargon, because I'll be in a meeting and half of it will be people with military backgrounds, half of it will be engineers that have never been in the military, and you find yourself using that military language, and you look around the room and you see half the people with blank looks on their face like, I've got no idea what you're talking about. And it was interesting because when I came to Intel has this vast array of jargon and acronyms that are very similar to the military. And so I've got one half of the room using their set of acronyms. I got my side of the room using my acronyms. And finally, we like, okay, everybody stop using acronyms. You got to tell me what these things are. And so I would say learning to articulate what that thing is before I use the acronym is the thing I find myself still trying to break myself up. And it's very hard to do.
When I first started reporting on this industry, that was one of the hardest learning curves. Everyone spoke in acronyms, and I almost made my own dictionary of them. But
Yeah.
well, thank you for sharing those points of advice for the next generation as well. That's a very important part of this conversation. And I really appreciate you sharing your perspective, your career, your journey, your learned lessons. It's so important for others to hear. And I really appreciate your time.
Really wonderful doing this. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Rookies to Rockstars. GovCon doesn't come with a playbook, but these stories might be the next best thing. Follow the show, share it with someone still figuring it out, and connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you.